Hi, in today's video we have something different. I'm going to call this Uncommon Failure Mode number 3 for a NuTone IMA3303. So what we're looking at is an NuTone IMA3303. It has a production date of around 2005 or 2006, so it's one of the last production runs of this model. And this set came in from a local customer about 2 weeks ago, and it had a fairly typical and normal amplifier failure. So I rebuilt the amplifier and the power supply, did the usual bench test after the repair was complete, and everything checked out and seemed to work properly, so I packed it up and shipped it back to the customer. They reported that after it had been installed for about 24 hours, it did something very similar to what we're looking at here. This set is actually powered up, but you'll notice that the display is blank, although the backlights are on the LCD display, even though it's probably kind of hard to see on the video. And sorry about the handheld, but I'm at the office workbench, not at the shop right now, so I wanted to shoot this before I powered this off and to take it to the shop. Yesterday when I set this up here on the bench to test it and see what was going on with it, initially everything worked correctly. I powered it up, the radio played, I made all of the normal settings on it, I hooked it up to our standard terminal board and a single remote speaker for testing. The chime module worked, everything looked fine. In fact, I called the customer to report that initially I didn't find anything wrong with it, but we decided to leave it on the bench overnight to see what would happen. And when I came in this morning, this is the condition that it's in. The display is blank, none of the buttons respond for the radio, the intercom controls don't work. When I first came in, periodically there were some brief flashes of information on the display, as if it was trying to display, it perhaps was the time or some other information. I was actually hoping that I might catch one of those flashes on the video, but I don't know if it'll happen when we're recording or not. I did some quick voltage measurements on the unit, and the power supply voltages all seem correct. The red LED power light on the main board is lit, and I know the transformers are good. The transformers are not hot, so it's not a problem with it drawing too much current or too much power from the transformers. It's got to be something else. I have an idea what it may be, but I'm not certain yet. So I'm going to zoom in on the display and wait a little bit and see maybe we can catch one of the flashes. Well, of course, we caught it. We did good. Look at that. Check it out. Some random information being shown on the display. It took about 5 minutes to capture that, although I'm going to edit the blank parts out because nobody really wants to watch a blank screen. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a reset on it before I power it off. So we'll open up the door. For those who don't know, the reset button is located behind the little hole. There was another flash on the display. That was cool. So the reset button is in the little hole to the right of the memory set button, and I've just got a swab with a wooden stick on it, and I'm going to push it, and nothing. Although we're getting more intermittent flashes. Now we have 1 o'clock, and apparently the reset has brought it back to life.
You could go span at leadoff in center field, a lefty. Joe Panic
for the time being. I don't think that it will stay in this condition, and I think I know, see, there it went again. So I think I know what's wrong with it. I've seen this on one other IMA3303 from about the same production date, so I'm going to power this off now. I don't think I'll get to it at the shop until next week. But when I work on it, I'll do a follow-up video to let you know what I found. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I'm not going to make two videos out of this. I'm just going to splice them together, so when you see it, you'll get to see what's wrong, the first part, and then the solution at the end. Thanks for watching. See you again on part 2. Hi, I'm at the shop, and today I'm working on the IMA3303 that you saw in the first part of the video, the one with the fading out display. I hope you watched the first part. And I thought I would take this chance to sort of give you an overview of what I think the problem may be and some parts of an IMA3303 that most people have never seen. So this is the microprocessor display board out of that IMA3303, the one in the first part of the video. You can see it looks like a fairly simple board, and in some respects it is. You've got a backlit LCD display. You have a bunch of tactile switches. These all correspond with the buttons on the front of the panel. You've got some LEDs here. Over here you've got a voltage regulator. You've got some circuitry to monitor and recharge the backup battery. And down here is where it gets a little more interesting. Down here you have two 74HC 374 chip, and these are fairly standard flip-flop chip, and these are used in this type of application as communication buffers with the microcontroller that's on the other side of the board. And then you have this little board right here, which is mounted upside down, and here's an example of what's on that board. And what you have here are two clock crystals, and you also have an 8-channel analog multiplex / demultiplexer. This is used primarily, I think, as a buffer to allow the microcontroller to communicate on the communication bus of the master station. So that's what's on there, and this is all fairly ordinary. But when we flip it over, we get to the part that's a little more interesting. So you can see right here, these are foam blocks that are glued to the back of the board to give it some rigidity when it's mounted in the faceplate. But mounted right down here is the microcontroller. And for those of you who are not familiar with microcontrollers, this is essentially the brain of the IMA3303. In some respects, it would be considered the IMA3303 itself, because without this, the rest of it does nothing. So for those of you who may have searched around with problems on your IMA or IM3303, you may have run across conversations or postings on the internet that talk about microcontroller problems with the IMA or IM3303. And that's because this chip is a very simplified version of what you have in your home computer that makes it operate as a computer. This is the chip that makes the IMA3303 function the way it does. And the reason that this is a problem when it becomes damaged is that while this chip is available as a component, and with a little bit of effort and skill, this one could be removed and a new one could be soldered onto the board in its place. What makes this operate is the information that's loaded into it. That type of information is commonly referred to as firmware, and firmware is simply a long list of instructions that tells it how to operate when a user asks the system to do something. So for instance, if you walk up to your master station and you press the button to listen to the FM radio, you're not actually turning on a switch like you do when you walk into a room and flip on a light switch. You're not making a mechanical closure that causes the radio to turn on. What you're actually doing is you're launching a series of instructions that are programmed into the microcontroller, and the microcontroller does many individual steps one after another, but since they all happen at the speed of light, essentially, it appears as if they all happen at the same time, or it's one big step. But it's actually not. When you walk up and push the FM button, the red LED light comes on, the display has to switch from the clock to the radio station readout, then it has to adjust itself to the last radio station that was listened to, and the amplifier has to turn on, and then you hear the radio station. So it's a series of steps. If the microcontroller becomes damaged, let's say your house gets hit by lightning, or you have some kind of unusual high voltage power surge from your utility company in your home, anything that damages the microcontroller or corrupts the firmware, that means it corrupts the information information that's stored in this, your IMA3303 won't function correctly. It doesn't know how to because it can't follow the instructions that were programmed into it. Similarly, sometimes you'll just have a normal power outage, and when your power does come back on, your 3303 isn't really working quite right. And that's why on the front of the board, or through the faceplate, this last switch right here says power reset. When you push this to reset the master station, what you're actually doing is you're resetting the microcontroller. This is an 80-pin package. There are 20 connections on each side of the little black square, and one of those is a reset pin. So when you push the reset button on the front, you're resetting the microcontroller back to its original default instructions, and it'll clear up any errors that were caused temporarily by the power being off and then back on. That's an easy problem that most people can fix themselves. But if your house gets hit by lightning, like if you live in Florida, for instance, and this gets damaged, it's a real problem, because while this component may be replaceable, when you order one of these from a supply house, it comes in blank. It has no firmware in it. And the way this board is designed, there is no place to plug in the board to, say, a computer and upload the firmware to it. It wasn't made that way. There's no header on it. There's no place that you can connect into the board. So that means that these microcontrollers were pre-programmed at the assembly house before this board was manufactured. So not only isn't there a provision on the board to program the microcontroller, there's also no program. That was done by probably the chip manufacturer for NuTone, or at some intermediate step before it got to the assembly house, or perhaps it was done at the assembly house, don't really know. But when these models went out of production, that firmware was lost, or if NuTone still has it, they're not sharing. So if you have a damaged microcontroller or you have damaged firmware, you have a real problem. That's some of the mystery around an IMA3303 that has unusual problems after a lightning strike. One of the other things that's interesting about this board is you can see here this row of pins. That row of pins are these pins here, which is what connects the display to the rest of the board. It may be a little hard to see, but if you follow the traces on the board that come off of each of these pins, you see they go up and then bend and go across. If you follow them around, you'll find that they all end up at their own individual pins on the microcontroller. So what this tells you is the information that's shown on the display comes directly from the microcontroller, and there's actually no other components in between here and here. This is a good way to make a general assessment of the condition of an IMA3303, because if the display is lit up and it shows proper information, even though other parts of the system may not be working, there's a good chance that your microcontroller is okay. If you get a set that has the display is blank and there's no information at all, that's a bad sign, because that may mean that the microcontroller is damaged. Common symptoms of lightning damage sets are the display will be blank even though the backlights will be on. Sometimes all of the red LEDs will be lit at the same time, and the LEDs being lit is also driven from the microcontroller. Everything happens in the microcontroller. So it's a serious problem if it becomes damaged, and if you have a set with a damaged microcontroller, generally speaking, this board has to be replaced with a board from a used model, and that's a hard thing to find sometimes. So back to this side of the board, other than the microcontroller, everything on this board is replaceable, except perhaps for the display itself, because this is a unique part, and sourcing this, I haven't found who the supplier of this was, so finding one of these may be tough, but these very rarely cause a problem. So that's sort of the ins and outs of the microcontroller board on an IMA3303. Now let's talk briefly about our actual problem with this set. If you watched the video, the first part of the video carefully, you would have seen, and I explained that when the set was originally powered up, everything worked perfectly. There were no problems that I can see, and then left it on overnight at the office to see what would happen. And when I came in that morning, the display was blank, and you saw in the video how you would get these brief random flashes of weird information on the display. So what does that tell you? Well, what it tells you is that it's not a microcontroller problem, I would bet, because if it were, it wouldn't happen down the road after it had been powered up for 10 or 12 hours. It would have happened immediately. So what kind of problems happen after a set has been powered up initially for 10 or 12 hours? Well, usually, and also taking into consideration that when the display would flash with the random information on it, the segments that would light up would be very dim and flickery looking. And that, to me, indicates a power problem. Since it had a lot of gibberish on the display and it couldn't maintain the gibberish for any length of time, it would briefly come on and flash and blink and fade in and out and then disappear again. That also, to me, indicates a power-related problem. So what we're going to look for on this board is probably something in this section where I believe what's going on is there's a fault or a failure in this part of the board, and the microcontroller isn't receiving the power that it needs to operate correctly. While microcontrollers have a fairly wide tolerance for voltage input, so I'm going to be looking for a power supply related or a power related issue and see if I can solve it. So I'm going to work on it now, put it back together. The testing is going to have to be overnight because we have to duplicate the first go around of testing. So Part 3 will be probably tomorrow. Hi, so about 20 hours have passed since I completed the repair on this IMA3303. I was able to figure out that the problem that was causing the fluttering display was a power-related issue on the microcontroller board, and I repaired that board, reassembled the set it up here on the workbench, and it's been running for the last 20 hours. And this morning it seems to work fine. The radio plays. I had it set up with two remote stations, a door station. Check those. Intercom functions work fine. So I think the problem has been solved. The real question at this point is the power-related failure on the microcontroller board going to become one of the items on the 10 most common things that go wrong with IMA3303? The answer is I'm not sure yet. So far I've only seen two sets that have this problem. Oddly enough, they were both sets that were made around 2005, and they both had a very similar type of problem. The first one I saw was the problem had advanced more than this one. By the time I saw the set at the customer's home, it was doing the fluttering display, and this display was blanking out almost all the time. Whereas on this one, it took 12 or so hours for that to happen after the initial power-up. So I think the other one was further along than this one was. The other question is, what does this mean at our shop on these sets when they come in for general repair? And I think the answer to that is it means that those components on the microcontroller board are going to get replaced out as a matter of course, whether or not it shows this problem. The other question could be, why is this problem occurring, and is it going to occur more often in the future? I think that this problem so far is confined to sets that were probably made somewhere between 2003 and the end of production, which was 2007. And all of those sets were made at the final factory where they were assembled, where the boards were assembled in China. And I think what it comes down to is it's a component quality issue. Since those sets are identical to the sets that were made in the previous factory before 2003, there were no board changes. They are virtually identical. It has to come down to either the way the sets were assembled, which I don't think is the case, or it comes down to the quality of components that were used. The sets that were made from 2003 through the end of 2003 through the end of 2007 also have other similar types of failures that can be defined down to quality of component issues, and those are usually general power supply failures and amplifier failures. So I think it's a similar type of situation, but here at this shop we're going to rebuild those microcontroller boards as a matter of course, because the reality of the situation is if someone sends us their intercom from somewhere in the United States, and we need to be assured that when we send it back, there's not going to be an ongoing problem that's going to show up a day or two after it's reinstalled. And since it isn't practical in most cases to bench test a unit for 2 days after it's been repaired, and since the cost of the components to rebuild the microcontroller board are minimal, it makes more sense to do it on the first go around. So that's what we've learned with this particular set. If your set shows similar problems, I would recommend that it be investigated and repaired sooner rather than later. If you let it go, it could cause damage to the microcontroller, which then is a much more expensive and complicated repair. That's all for this video. If you found this useful and informative, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Subscribing to our channel raises our search rankings on YouTube, which means more people will find our videos and we'll be able to help them also. That's all for today. See you on the next video.